Hi, my name is Bart.
My name is Lewis. We are two pilots with a passion for history.
Welcome to our channel, High on History.
Welcome back and welcome to episode 4.
We are now entering the 20th century. The population of Brussels is booming and the appearance of the city is changing into much of what we see today. These changes will continue in the city after World War II, which we'll discuss later in this episode with Professor Corin.
That's right. Many great minds come together in the young, bustling capital of our new nation. And these people will in turn change the course of history.
Unfortunately, despite all these new thoughts and innovations, Europe, and at the center of it, Brussels, will be experiencing war and suffering for the next 50 years.
Yes. However, in contrast, the interbellum period will provide prosperity and the city of Brussels will bloom.
It's a very interesting and diverse period in our history, and we are here together with Professor Kesteloot to discuss and experience what has happened at the Royal Museum of the Army and Military History here in Brussels.
Hello again to High on History. We're now inside of the museum in the World War I commemoration room with some big guns behind us, as you can tell, and our King Albert I in the back. And I'm joined today by Miss Kesteloot. How are you?
Fine. You?
I'm good, thank you. Could you please introduce yourself to me and to the people?
Yes, of course. My name is Chantal Kesteloot. I studied history at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And now I'm a member of the CG-SOMA. So it's a Center for War and Contemporary Society where I deal with public history. And I also coordinate the website Belgium World War II.be.
Nice. So that's really your specification, World War I, World War II?
Yeah.
Perfect. That's why we contacted you. Just to remind the people, the previous episodes, also for you, we discussed Belgium during the Napoleonic era, the Belgian Revolution. Belgium is a young country. The city of Brussels is growing. So my first question to you, I can call you Chantal?
Yes, of course.
What is Brussels and what does Belgium look like at the beginning of the 20th century, so the year 1900?
At the beginning of the 20th century, Brussels is becoming an international city, but you still have remains of a provincial city. And you can say that's still the case today. International because Belgium has become an important state, which was not so much sure just after the revolution. Belgium is a very important power on international level, also on national level, because industrial revolution took place here on the continent, so it's becoming a rich country. It's also becoming a colonial power, and at the end of the 19th century, Congo is becoming to ensure Belgium a lot of revenues, even if at that time it's still the personal property of King Leopold II. International because we have here in Brussels a World Fair, not only at the end of the 19th century, when also this area where we are now was built under the kingship of Leopold II. It was built for the 50th anniversary of Belgium. We have also another World Fair at the beginning of the 20th century. So you have a combination provincial, because we have still the center of the city, but we have also the suburbs, and the rural area is still very close. So the connection between rural area and the center of the city is something important. People move from the center to the suburbs, and all poor people migrate from the suburbs to the center of the city to have a job. So it's really a combination. You have also development of a lot of communication, railways, tramways are becoming important. So the city is really changing. There is also more and more population. At the eve of the First World War, we have almost 800 inhabitants in Brussels. It's a lot. Of course, some of the municipalities are still really rural. You spoke about Evere, for example. It's still a village. Odergem, Schaerbeek.
Yeah.
Schaerbeek was already a very important municipality. So what we call the municipality of the first crown, so the municipality that are very close to Brussels as a center. So Saint-Gilles, Saint-Josse, Molenbeek, Anderlecht. They are already really crowded. Some parts are really industrial. Let's think on Molenbeek, which was more or less called the small Manchester. So you have really that important industrial dimension. Brussels is also a place of communication through water. It's becoming a sea hub. The sand has been covered, so a lot of food and goods are brought by water. So it's really an international city. It's the capital of the country.
It's like you said, it's a crossroad. You have the south of Belgium with a lot of coal and industry coming to Brussels, going to Antwerp. It's really a crossroad, you would say.
Yes, it's really a crossroad. But you have to imagine in that time, the most industrial part of the country were in the south of the country. So a lot of richness was created in the south of the country, and more specifically in province of Liège and province of Hainaut, where you have coal mines, you have metal industry, you have also glasses industry. Well, the north of the country was still more rural. And in the mid of the 19th century, we had an important crisis linked to potatoes crisis. And so we called about poor Flanders at that period. And at that period, still a lot of people coming from Flanders, coming to find work, not only in Wallonia, in the coal mine, but also in Brussels. And you have a lot of people that are coming here. And that will also change in a certain way the linguistic landscape of the city.
Yeah, that was a question. Actually, a question I was going to ask you later, but let's talk about it now. At the beginning of the 20th century, so around the year 1900, what is the lingua franca, as we say? What do people in the city speak? What language?
In fact, at the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of people still speak Dutch dialect, different Dutch dialect, because there is at that time not really a unified Dutch language. We spoke about dialect. In fact, when we go back to the first census, it's 1846, a big majority of the population declared to speak Dutch dialect. It was also a very surprise because all official political life, economic life in this country was going on in French. Most of the newspapers were French, but a majority of the population was speaking Dutch, or at least Flemish dialect. And in Brussels, we have also that situation. We have growing people that declare themselves as being bilingual. So about the years 1880, you have more or less 25% of the people will say they speak in French, 40% say that are bilingual, and 25% more or less speaking a Dutch dialect. But with the time, more and more people will speak French for economic reasons. It's a kind of a social, if you want to have a better job, if you want to have tools in terms of social mobility, French is the weapon you need to have.
Interesting.
And so that means that, for example, people that are coming from Flanders, when they have children, but even if that time going to school was not mandatory, it will only be mandatory from the spring of 1914. So you have to imagine some children are not going to school. They are not mandatory to go to school. But if you send your children to school, and of course, as a parent, you want the best for your children, and having the best for your children, that means that they should speak French. And so with the change of generation, the first generation children are still bilingual, but they are educated in French. And so that means that when they have children, they will only speak French with them. And so we have a slow but real important Francization of the city. And so that means at the very end of the census, because the census was suppressed in the 60s, we have Brussels as a majority of people declaring themselves as French speaking.
Yeah, especially today, I think only less than 10% speaks Flemish. Let's be honest. Yeah.
Yes, it's very difficult because we have no clues to know. There is no census anymore, so we can imagine between 10-15% of people are speaking Dutch.
The next question is, we touched on this earlier on, the innovations. I know myself, a lot of new things were invented, right, at the beginning of the 20th century. Can you just talk about this to us?
Yes, of course. Life changes a lot, because that means what has changed? Electricity was introduced in a lot of houses, water, which is very, very important today. We cannot even realize what it should be to live without having water, daily water, when you open and you have water.
For us now, it's like normal.
It's like normal, but at that time it was not the case. So a lot of things changes, and so that means that the way of life of the people also change a lot. People could also go from one part of the city to another part of the city. It was also at the end of the 19th century we have the first cars in Brussels. So it means that the way people were living in the city, but also inside their homes, change a lot. And so that means that slowly we are going to another way of life, and that will bring us to the 20th century.
Yeah, that's right. Before we're gonna start talking about the First World War, before the war started, what was the political situation in Brussels and also Belgium? I know we have Albert I just behind us. How influential were the royals at this point in time?
So there are three parts in your question.
Yeah.
I should say we had at the national level, we don't speak about federal level at that time, we have a period from 1984 until the First World War with a Catholic majority. So for 30 years, the country was in the hands of a Catholic government, and Liberal Party was in the opposition. It was one of the two party that exist more or less since the beginning of Belgium. And there was also a third party because in 1985, what we could call today the Socialist Party was created, and it also had an importance here in Brussels. So you have the national government, which is a Catholic government, but you have also a lot of municipalities. And in the municipalities in Brussels, the liberals are still very important, and most of the municipality of the first crown of Brussels are in hands of a liberal majority or even a liberal and socialist majority. So you can, in a certain way, consider that importance of the liberal in Brussels, in different municipalities, as a kind of counterpower to the national government, which is in the hand of the Catholic. And of course, for the liberal and the socialists, they also hope to come on power, or to come back in the case of the liberal, or to be associated at the power in the case of the socialist. And in 1912, there is a general election, and socialist and liberal will join their forces against the Catholic, because slowly the Catholic majority is going down since a few elections, and they really hope in 1912 to win this election. And it's really disappointing because it's not the case. And the Catholic majority is even becoming stronger than it was before. And so there were a lot of demonstrations also here in Brussels, because it was also a period where there was no system, one man, one vote. We have a really complicated systems, which is called universal. I don't even know the English expression. I will say it in French, but I will explain it. Suffrage universel tempéré par le vote plural. So that means that every man, not woman, every man had the right to vote, but some of them has more than one vote, two or three.
Because they have more money?
Because they had more money, because they had an academic degree, because they were honored. So it's a very unequal system, but nevertheless, the first time this system was introduced in 1993, the socialists were elected 28 members in the parliament. So it was really a kind of revolution, you can imagine. For the first time, a worker could join the parliament. So it was really an important change. And so they also hoped to participate at the power, to be associated. And so the demand for the system one man, one vote was really important. There were a lot of demonstrations, including after the defeat of 1912. So we have that aspect. And then third part of the question, the monarchy. As you know, until 1909, King Leopold II was on the power. It was very contested at the end of his life, not only because of his role in Congo. There was an international commission, and he was obliged to seize the Congo state to the Belgian government, so that Belgium become also a colonial power, which was not the case before, because it was a kind of personal property of King Leopold II, who never went himself to Congo. And so it changed. So after 1908, Belgium had a colony in Congo. In 1909, Leopold II died. And his successor was King Albert. We call him now Albert I, but at this time, at this time it was only Albert, because he was the first one who has this name, and it's really important because the way they conceive monarchy was completely different. For the first time, for example, it was also the period when the development of cinema, of photography, and for the first time, he also allowed journalists, camera, to accompany them when they were moving into the country, into the streets. So we have a lot of films showing that. And they also behave in a certain way, even if it's a certain way artificial, but as a bourgeois family.
Yes.
So they show themselves with the children. They don't hesitate to say we are a family like any others, which was of course not the case, but it was that idea. So in a certain way, you can say they used the movie to
promote
themselves, and the movie used them to promote themselves.
Yeah.
So there was a kind of win-win association between Albert and Elizabeth and cinema, photography. And so they were really promoting themselves, and each other were promoting the other one.
So, we mentioned the First World War. Albert I, I can call him the War King of Belgium. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So, what led to the invasion of Germany? To the invasion of Belgium by Germany, and how was this 4-year period for Brussels? Was it good or bad?
Yeah. First, we should also remember that Belgium, when it was created in the 19th century, was created as a neutral state. So it means that it was not supposed to be involved in war. And so the great powers were also the guarantee of that neutrality. And among those great powers, Germany was one of them. So we could not imagine in a certain way that Germany should violate this neutrality, because that's a really important element. We don't imagine today how it was a shock, an international shock, an international event, the fact that the Belgian neutrality was violated.
Nobody saw it coming.
Nobody saw it coming, but also it was something that was not acceptable for the powers. So we today know that what has brought Great Britain into the war was the fact that the Belgian neutrality was violated, because it was something unthinkable for the great powers at that time. It was really important. The neutrality, you are not supposed to violate the neutrality of a country. So, if we go back to the end of June 1940, assassination of the Archduke François Ferdinand in Sarajevo. The very first day, when you look at the newspaper, you see it's a very important fact, major fact, and all the headlines are going about this. But after a few days, it's no longer the case. And so we could say at the mid of July 1940, what's important here in Belgium is, for example, the Tour de France, because we hope for the first time a Belgian could win the Tour de France. So that's really important. And so slowly, the news of the assassination is becoming minor.
Yeah, it's fading away.
It's fading away. Then you have the episode of the ultimatum of Austria-Hungary against Serbia. In a few days, the things will completely change. What's interesting, for example, here in Brussels, so at the very, very end of July, and then 29th of July, you have the presence of Jean Jaurès. Jean Jaurès is a French socialist leader, and he coming here with the idea workers should go on strike if there is war. Okay? La grève contre la guerre. In French, it's a lot. It sounds good. He takes the train, he goes back to Paris, and 2 days later he will be killed.
Really?
Yes, and it's a kind of, it's not only a real death, but it's also a symbolic death of peace.
It's like a martyr now.
It's like a martyr. Of course, even if he has not been killed, the war should have broken on, but it's symbolic. So because a lot of thousands of people went to listen to Jean Jaurès here in Brussels, it was in the Cirque Royal, and you see people on the street after the meeting, and you see people against the war. So it's really an important event. And within less than 1 week, the spirits will completely change, because on 3 of August is the German ultimatum asking the permission to come through Belgium to invade France.
Did we grant it or not? I guess
no. So Belgium said no. So the king, the parliament, everyone was with the idea to say no. And within a few days, there is a kind of patriotic mobilization we'd never seen before. So Belgium was created in 1830, so it was still a young state, and we could argue, what does it mean to feel like a Belgian citizen in 1940? On the 4th of August, you see here in Brussels a lot of people going into the street with flags, with supporting the king. The king is coming on his horse into the parliament when he will pronounce famous speeches, and then he will go and join the army. And so really within a few days, there is also it's not only patriotic dimension, there is also a kind of panic, because at that time you have the change of money in gold. It was still a kind of automatic change.
A lot of things are happening.
Yeah, so a lot of people went to the bank. They want to have their money back because they were afraid. And after the first day, so on 4th of August, the war broke out. And after the first day, you also see in Brussels a lot of refugees that are coming to Brussels because the war is starting in the east of the country. So they want to escape to the war, also because the beginning of the First World War was a very dramatic war for civilians. And we know today that in August 1940, more civilians than military were killed. So there were about 6,000 to 7,000 Belgian civilians that were killed. In some places, in Dinan, for example, you have almost 700 citizens that were killed, but it also happened in Aarschot, in Leuven, in some localities in Luxembourg. So people tried to escape, and at that period, more or less 1.5 to 2 million people tried to left the country. They went to the Netherlands, they went to France, some of them went to Great Britain, and for almost 600,000 Belgian people, they remained in exile during the whole war. So for part of the population, the experience of the First World War is the experience of living abroad, being a refugee. It's an important fact. And for some of them, it was, of course, the first time they left their city, their villages, because we were not in a period when everyone was going on holiday every year. So it was really also a cultural contrast. You go to France, you have other ways of speaking French. People have other food uses. When you are going to Britain, they drink tea and not coffee. So the confrontation, or they are Protestant and not Catholic. Yeah. So the confrontation is really important. Regarding Brussels, in fact, no struggle will take place in Brussels.
That's good.
Yeah. That's good. There were some trenches that were created, but on 18 and 19 August 1914, the mayor of Brussels, Adolf Max, said no fight, no struggles, and we also know that some guns were drawn into Ixelles, into the Étang d'Ixelles, for example, the lake in Ixelles. So no struggle. And on 20 of August, the Germans arrived in Brussels, thousands of them, because they will only pass through Brussels. They will not stay in Brussels. But that during hours, German soldiers on their horses through the streets, and there are a lot of testimonies of people who were really impressed. And it's also interesting to say why they were impressed, because at that time, most of the armies had uniforms with very flamboyant colors, which was not the case of the Germans. So people, in a certain way, were disappointed because they had the idea uniforms, you should be proud of it, but in a certain way they realized it's another kind of army.
So the uniforms before were with a lot of color, and now the German uniform was like gray and a bit boring.
Yeah. And very quickly the confrontation is becoming real brutal, because for Belgium, what's interesting is the First World War is an experience of occupation. And in Brussels also it's an experience of occupation. But that means that the German troops that will stay in Brussels, they ask compensation for their presence. Compensation in money, compensation in food. And so the city of Brussels is supposed to pay very huge, important amounts of money.
Correction. Yeah.
Yeah. And the city, even if they associate with the other municipality, because all the mayors are dealing together through an instance that's called the Conference of the Mayors of Brussels, that are dealing since the end of the 19th century. When they have common problems, they are speaking together.
Yeah.
And so they are supposed to pay. They don't have that money. And Adolf Max tried to negotiate, but the German refused. And already in September, so just 1 month after the beginning of the occupation, he will be imprisoned in Germany, and he will stay there until the end of the First World War. Adolf Max.
Yeah.
He's not the only one. Other mayors will also later on be in jail and be deported to Germany.
Great.
So the contact between the German, and when we will talk about the Second World War, the context will be completely different. But 1940, the contact between Empire and the Belgian authority is very, very brutal, and it will still be that way during all of the occupation. Very quickly, because Belgium is a country that needs to import a lot of food, was already the case long before. Very quickly, the population is confronted with food storage. Also because at the very end, before the beginning of the war and the very first day of the war, a lot of people bought as much as possible. So shops were really plundered.
So the stocks were really low.
The stocks were really low. So there was a kind of plundering into some shops of the city. And so very quickly, there is a problem of food. And that will be a very important problem during all the war. And of course, in an urban context, it's more a problem than when we are living in rural areas.
So is there a famine? Would you use your word famine, or
it could have been
borderline?
Yeah, it would have been if there wasn't been a kind of miracle, I should say, because at the beginning of the war, the United States were still neutral, and some Belgian authorities that were remaining in the country, not the government, because the government was in exile.
In London, right?
No, in the northern of France, in the surrounding of Le Havre, in the small village called Sainte-Adresse.
Okay.
And so some of industrial and local political elites that remained in Belgium managed to have an agreement with the German occupier that allowed a kind of international
help
that saved Belgium from the famine. So food was imported, and the agreement was that food that was imported from the United States could not be seized by the German occupier, so that the Belgian population, so that it could be used by the Belgian population. And why were the United States and Canada ready to help? It was because of the brutality of what happened in August 1940. Not only the fact that the Belgian neutrality was violated, so I say it was really a shock for the international.
This was reported by newspapers?
It was reported by newspaper, but also violence against civilians. And those violence against civilians, I said 6,000 to 7,000 civilians that were killed.
It's a lot.
But there were also a lot of rumors, and rumors makes the things even worse than they were. So, for example, it was told that the German soldiers took the eye away, and that some German soldiers were seen with a lot of eyes, that they cut hands. And it's interesting because there is, of course, a connection with Congo. So, and because at the very beginning of the war, the freedom of press was suppressed. So that means that there was places for information, misinformation, fake news like this, because there was no power, no traditional newspaper to correct, to give other information. But that means that the shock on international level also had as impact that there was it was the first time in history that such a big international help was organized. And it was really, really organized, because here you had some local groups that were in charge to distribute this help.
The Red Cross, for example?
Not really the Red Cross, but the municipalities were very active. And what is interesting is the way people were helped, because we were still living in a kind of 19th century society with social classes, social groups that were not in connection with each other. And the way the rich people were helped was completely different from the way the poor people were helped. Poor people were invited to go to have soup distribution, to have bread. But for the rich people, and it's interesting because all longer the war took place, or more social groups were touched by economic problems. But for the bourgeois family, going and to receive some bread, some food, that was not something
they were used to. Right?
So they introduced they called it economic restaurants. So you went to a restaurant, you paid a very small amount, and you received so much more than what you were paying for. But it gives you the illusion you are still paying for something. So you were keeping your role, your places in the social system. And what makes the situation at the end of the war even worse, with the last, at that time they didn't know it was the last, but with the last Allied offensive, a lot of civilians from northern of France, from the west of the country, were obliged to leave their cities, their home, and were coming in Brussels. Yeah. And so there are not fixed figures, but if Brussels had a population of about 800,000 inhabitants, in October, November 1918, to that population, there were more than that population, you had more than 120,000 refugees. Wow. And so that means that in a city that has suffered from hunger, from cold, because it was also difficult to find coal, because coal was also used for the army. So people suffer also for coal. So, and you had suddenly more than 100,000 refugees. You have to find places for them to sleep. You had to find food for them to eat. So some of the schools were used, some of the buildings were used. And third aspect, it was also the first period when we were confronted to Spanish flu. So you had not only the war.
On top of that, you had also
the refugees. You don't know those people, where are they coming from, who are they? Yeah. Are those people not those who are bringing Spanish flu? You know, that kind of reaction. Yeah. And you have also Spanish flu. So it was a very complicated situation.
Very challenging period for
Brussels. Challenging for Brussels. And you have to imagine, we now have the idea, 11 November 1980, it's the end of the war. Everybody is going on the street because they were
celebrating.
In Brussels, it's not the case, because on 11 of November 18, the German army is still in Brussels.
Really?
Yes. And if you know, in Germany, there is a revolution. So the Kaiser has to abandon, and
Wilhelm II, I think.
Yeah. And there is a Republic proclamation, and there are also social groups that are very active. We
communists.
You don't have to forget. In October 1917, there was the Bolshevik Revolution. So also in Germany, there were a group of.
In Belgium also.
So in Brussels, some of the soldiers were shooting against their officer.
Really?
Yeah. And so the days between 11 and 15 November are really, really touching days, because, of course, some civilians were killed because of that struggle between soldiers and officers. The soldiers tried to convince the population to do the revolution with them. So on the parliament, you had the red flag.
Really?
Yeah. And so it's only on 15th of November that the night from 15 to 16, that the last German soldiers are leaving Brussels. So 11th of November is not really the day. The day in Brussels is 22 November, and that day is really a kind of apotheose. The King Albert is coming back. He goes to the parliament, and he will have his famous speeches when he will promise the introduction of one man, one vote. So the day in Brussels, there are two moments in Brussels. The first moment is 17 November. 17 November is the day that Adolf Max, who was in jail in Germany, comes back. And so we have pictures of Adolf Max on the Grand Place. You see thousands of people.
It's like a hero.
Yes, it's like a hero. I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000 people you can have on the Grand Place. There must be some figures. And really, he is the hero of the day. And so between 17 November and 22, Brussels will be prepared to the back of the king. And for example, there will be some provisionary monuments that will be built everywhere in the cities on the road that the king will take on 22 of November. On 22 of November, there will also be a lot of armies that will come into the streets in Brussels. So 22 of November, we have some films about this event. It's really the day when Brussels was liberated.
Interesting.